Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us at this How To Academy event. I'm Vas Christodoulou, one of the curators of our program. Tonight's event is going to be an extraordinary meeting of art and science. Psychiatrist and neuroscientist Iain McGilchrist is the author of The Master and His Emissary, one of the most profoundly original and meaningful works of philosophy in our time, and now the author of a sequel, The Matter with Things. He's in conversation with a man whose genius for writing and performing makes him a fully paid up member in the pantheon of comedy greats. Alongside Monty Python, Fawlty Towers, A Fish Called Wanda, and many more extraordinary films and television programs, John Cleese is also the author of a new book with direct relevance to this conversation called Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide. Please give a huge welcome to Iain McGilchrist and John Cleese.
Wow.
We just had a Chinese meal together.
Yes, it was very good. Yes.
So I think your book was the most important book I ever read, and I think a lot of us here feel that. And I was saying to Iain, and it's absolutely true, I find him, despite the fact this is a pretty complicated subject, I find his writing so clear that I can read it much more easily than I can read most detective novels. Because most of the time when I'm reading, I think, wait a minute, I thought the author said this, or that's ambiguous, but this is clarity personified. So thank you for that. Now, I calculated that if we sort of generally go through the book, we have 3 seconds for every page. So we're already hanging behind. So basically, I want to ask you one question. Are you insane?
I thought you were going to ask me to summarize Proust.
But seriously, this is extraordinary. I mean, 10 years.
Yes.
1,500 pages. Why?
Well, quite. I often ask myself, yes, well, there is a serious answer, I think. I'm very concerned sorry to lower the tone so, but I'm very concerned, as I imagine a lot of people here are, about the way the world is going. And before I go, I wanted to say something I thought was relevant about it, from my experience of people and their brains. I think the things that, I would point to, that they're pretty obvious. Obviously, the top of the list has to be the destruction of our home, of the planet, but also of various strange things like destroying other cultures, destroying our own civilization. Turning ourselves into machines. I'm very alarmed at the speed with which mechanistic thinking and machine-like thinking is taking over in everyday life, not necessarily in strange areas of academia or something, but actually the business of leading a life now depends on your adopting a rather machine-like way of being, and we're encouraged, all of us, to think of ourselves as slightly faulty machines, because we've got emotions and bodies and things like that, which computers are not handicapped by. So all of that, and the lust for power and control, which is extremely worrying and accelerating apace, and the means whereby to acquire it by people who have little wisdom in how to use it. So this is the sort of setting. And for those of you who've read The Master and His Emissary, you'll know that rings bells for anyone who knows about the evolution of brain systems, effectively the main 2 systems being those that are physically and philosophically divided, the right and left hemispheres, because one of them is designed to enable us to control and manipulate, but not really to understand. That's the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is the one that helps us to understand everything, however subtle and complex, in context. And I just felt that we were running so far towards what I predicted in The Master and His Emissary, a culture which was dependent almost entirely on ways of thinking typical of the left hemisphere. That was part of it.
I was thinking that the obsession with robots at the moment
Yes.
Seems to come partly because people have forgotten that we have functions other than robotic ones.
Yes, I mean, it's one of those self-fulfilling things. The more you define what is valuable as what a machine can do, the less you value the humanity.
Yeah.
I've written a book which aims to redress this terrible, terrible, destructive, lemming-like rush towards our destruction through embracing a view that we and the cosmos are nothing but a heap of rubbish.
Yeah.
I'm a scientist, so I'm further worried by the way in which pop science and sort of popular philosophical discourse rushes to embrace a kind of very simplistic model, which is that of reductionist materialism, that there really only is matter, and in order to understand it, you take it apart and find what the bits are. You take it all apart and you find a handful of dust. You say, well, it doesn't mean anything. Well, yes, but it's slightly like taking a wonderful piece of music and listing all the notes in a notebook in order, alphabetically. And then say, well, we've got all the notes here, but I'm damned if I can see that it means anything at all. So that's also a concern, and that is not compelled on us. That view, that intellectually simplistic, morally damaging and spiritually bankrupt way of looking at the world is not entailed on us by anything in science. It's not entailed on us by reason. It's entailed on us by a very left hemisphere, very simple, very procedural vision of what science is and what reason is.
It's almost as though most scientists, especially biologists and psychologists, are not aware that physics changed completely in 1920.
Absolutely. And am I not right? Did you not start out reading physics at Cambridge?
No, I went to Cambridge. I got in on physics.
Oh, you got in on
physics. And then I discovered that some of the students coming to Cambridge to do physics were actually interested in it. And it occurred to me this gave them an unfair advantage. So I said, what can I do? And they said, very little, because you don't have the A-levels. You can do law. And I said, all right, I'll do law. Yeah, and I did that for 3 years and escaped immediately afterwards.
When you discovered that actually you could make people laugh.
Yes, that's right, which was the first time I'd ever discovered I had any creative ability at all, which fascinates me.
Yes.
That I've written this little book about creativity, and the people least interested in it are educationalists.
Yes.
I wrote to Bath, where I have a connection with the university, and I offered them twice to do talks to the students, remote talks,
yes.
and never heard back from them on either offer. Yeah. And what is that about? But
I think you're too woke, probably, John. I think you're probably too woke for them. But no, I mean, going back to physics, physics is so important. And there's a strange paradox that those scientists who study the inanimate world, long ago, over 100 years ago, abandoned this mid-19th century mechanistic model, have discovered that the universe is very complex and subtle, that matter is at least as complex as consciousness, and they're probably, almost certainly, interdependent elements.
And Max Planck said that mind came first.
He wasn't the only one, no, but Planck stated, yes, that consciousness is primary. And there are a lot of physicists who certainly would hold that, I'm not a physicist, of course, but I am interested in physics, and I have some kind friends who are physicists who sort of vet my maunderings in this direction. But yes, I mean, physicists have seen that consciousness is essential to existence, and yet biologists who deal with the animate universe have decided that it's much simpler than that, and that consciousness probably doesn't exist, or if it does, it's just something that's secreted by a brain, rather like urine from a kidney. I don't know how, but actually, here's the spoiler alert. Nobody knows how that could possibly happen.
Fascinating, because the resistance of mainstream scientists to what they discovered in the 1920s, quantum physics, the resistance is almost incomprehensible to me. What do you feel about it?
Well, of course, there's absolutely no resistance in the world of science outside of the biology, outside of the life sciences. And I'm not the only person in that area who's said, I wish that our colleagues in biology would catch up with physics. But I think there's a huge investment in the bio. I mean, I suppose that the amount of money, the amount of grants, the amount of positions in university that in one way or another come under one of the headings of biology, medicine, psychology, physiology.
Well, doctors in particular, aren't they? They have a very mechanistic view of the body.
Yes, I mean, it's sad, really. I mean, sometimes you say, it's not entirely obvious that the body is a machine. And they look at you in a slightly hurt way, like, sort of, oh, how could you say that? I mean, they're genuinely baffled.
Yes.
And I think that...
But that's the way they're taught, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, there's so much to cram into a medical education, as I discovered. I started with the handicap of being 10 years older than most people when I studied medicine. But even then, there was a hell of a lot to cram into your 6 years or whatever. But I would favour the American system that you can't read medicine as a first degree. And I would add the rider that first degree, which is the case in America, it's usually people who've done biology or something, that you ought to do something in the humanities. Before you become a doctor, if you're actually going to lay your hands on people, you should know something about human beings and not just about machines. So yes, anyway.
But I'm fascinated by the resistance to information. I know that Rupert Sheldrake went along to the BBC to discuss something with Richard Dawkins, and at some point he said to Dawkins, who'd said there was no evidence for what Rupert was saying, he said, "Did you read any of the stuff that I sent you to read before the program?" And Dawkins said, no, I didn't bother to because I knew it was nonsense.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Galileo, isn't it, and the Ecclesiastics, and he's saying, look through my beautiful new telescope at the craters on the moon, and they're saying we don't need to look because we know that they're not there. It's an extraordinary attitude. What's it about?
It is extraordinary.
It's left brain, isn't it? It's hanging on.
It's hanging on to the need for certainty, for the need to believe that you can explain everything.
Yeah.
By the way, that's a completely irrational, I mean, it's a disprovable point that we can understand everything, but it's also an irrational assumption. Why would, if you believe in evolution, which I certainly do, we are presumably somewhere maybe quite low down on the rungs of evolution. Why would our brains have evolved by 2021 to the point where we could understand everything in the cosmos? Yeah. And actually, since I'm very interested in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, my suggestion is that actually we now understand much less than we used to. We know a lot more information, but our understanding has not progressed pari passu with the amount of information. In fact, it's gone into the reverse. But I think that, there's a lot of reasons. As I say, it's a very powerful lobby. There's no incentive once you're entrained in it to rock the boat, to say things that will make your colleagues think you're unsound. Fortunately, in physics, everybody agrees that nobody understands quantum mechanics, and that if you do, you're an imposter. So they don't have the same hang-up about the idea that we don't really understand everything. We understand lots of things up to a point.
But the quest for certainty, you see, that seems to me about control, which is left hemisphere. And I sometimes feel that people want to be in control primarily if they feel anxiety.
I think you're right.
You know, if in creativity, if people are anxious for some reason, even if there's just time pressure, they resort to stereotypical thinking. They can't then play and get into something more creative.
It's so true. And in the writing of the book, I looked at the history of many scientists and how they made their discoveries, and many mathematicians and how they arrived at their now accepted conclusions. And there's research as well. I mean, what that shows, sorry, before I say what the research showed, what was clear from that is that although they did a lot of procedural thinking of a very routine kind at certain times in their life, that was not how they made these discoveries at all. They were made by intuitive insight, seeing connections between often shapes and forms that nobody had thought of as related before. So the myth that science is a matter of sort of making no assumptions at all, testing every possible hypothesis to exhaustion, well, no idiot did that. I mean, there wouldn't be time in the history of the universe to do it. People make what look like good intuitions about what might be going on here, and then they test it in certain ways. But often their insights are nothing to do with that. They rely on imagination. Science is a hugely imaginative enterprise, which doesn't mean it's made up, you know. Imagination is the way in which we get insight into things that we thought we knew.
And it's not, it's not necessarily verbal.
Absolutely. In fact, it's rarely verbal.
Einstein said that he felt that muscular sensation was actually part of his system of thought, and that while he was thinking, he would be unable to explain to anyone what he was thinking in words.
Oh, absolutely. And he used to play the keyboard or the violin or whatever, and come to it, and then his daughter describes it, now I've got it, and here we go. And famously, he couldn't explain in words what he had discovered for months after he'd made the discovery. But he's not alone. Going back to, in fact, the Greek world, but certainly in our own times, there were 18th century mathematicians like Euler who said, you know, I've got my conclusions, but how I'm to get there, I haven't yet discovered. But I mean, he was right. His conclusions were correct.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting that we jump to conclusions. In fact, interestingly, the left hemisphere is the one that does a lot of quick and dirty jumping to conclusions.
Does it?
And it's the right hemisphere that says, but hang on, it may be more complex than that. In fact, it's always seeing that things are more complex, and therefore that there need to be shades of meaning, and that things need to be nuanced and so on. Which is why I write long books, because in the end people ask you to summarize them, you know, like Proust. But in doing so, you do violence to the fact that there are, what's drawn together are many shades of things that qualify one another. And that most of what matters to us in life is implicit, not explicit in language.
It fascinated me that Bernard Berenson, who I think was the great Renaissance critic, that he could always tell when something was a fake, because he'd feel ill.
Yes. In his
You know, it wasn't something up here, the brushstrokes aren't right. He would just look at it and start feeling slightly sick.
That's it.
So that what comes up from intuition is not in a neatly typed out form of words.
Yes.